The Bronze Age collapse. Say those four words to a historian who specializes in the ancient Near East and watch their face change. Watch something flicker behind their eyes, something between awe and despair and deep, unresolved intellectual frustration. Because the Bronze Age collapse, which occurred approximately between 1200 and 1150 BCE, is the greatest civilizational catastrophe in the history of the ancient world. And after more than a century of intensive archaeological study and scholarly debate, we still do not fully understand why it happened. We still cannot say with confidence what force, or combination of forces, brought down, within the span of approximately 50 years, every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. Egypt weakened almost to the point of collapse. The Hittite Empire vanished entirely, completely, finally, without successors. Mycenaean Greece collapsed, and with it collapsed literacy itself, plunging Greece into 4 centuries of what historians call the Greek Dark Ages. The great trading city of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria was burned and abandoned, and its people never returned. The Kassite dynasty of Babylon fell. Cyprus's urban centers were destroyed. The palace economies of the Levant crumbled. Trade networks that had connected civilizations across thousands of kilometers ceased to function. And the world that emerged from the other side of this collapse, the Iron Age world, was a profoundly diminished, depopulated, and simplified world compared to what had existed before. But the Bronze Age collapse does not stand alone on this list. It is the most dramatic and the most well-documented case of simultaneous multi-civilizational collapse, but it shares this list with 11 other civilizations that vanished with a speed so startling, so complete, so at odds with their prior power and sophistication, that understanding their disappearances requires us to question some of the most basic assumptions we hold about how civilizations work, why they rise, and, perhaps more importantly, why they fall. The Mycenaean civilization of ancient Greece was, at its height in the period between 1600 and 1200 BCE, one of the most sophisticated and powerful societies in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Mycenaeans built massive palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and other centers, structures featuring enormous stone walls, elaborately decorated throne rooms, sophisticated administrative systems, and storehouses filled with goods gathered from across the Mediterranean through a complex network of trade. The Mycenaeans were literate. They used a writing system called Linear B to record administrative information, inventories, and transactions, and their culture influenced every subsequent period of Greek history, including the mythology of Homer, whose Iliad and Odyssey are set in a Mycenaean world. The heroes of Greek myth, Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, are Mycenaean figures. Their world was real. And then it ended. Between approximately 1200 and 1100 BCE, the Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed, abandoned, or diminished one by one. Pylos was burned. It shows evidence of fire damage and was never rebuilt. Mycenae itself was damaged and severely reduced. Tiryns survived in diminished form. The administrative systems collapsed. Linear B writing vanished from the historical record, not reduced, not simplified, but completely gone, and would not be replaced by a new writing system for 4 centuries. The population of Greece fell drastically. Trade networks collapsed. The elaborate bronze-working industry that had defined Mycenaean culture disappeared. And when writing returned to Greece in the 8th century BCE, it returned in the form of a completely different script, derived from the Phoenician alphabet, suggesting that the knowledge of Linear B was not merely dormant, but truly lost. that the people who knew it had died or dispersed, and that the knowledge had gone with them. What destroyed Mycenaean Greece? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. There is archaeological evidence of destruction at multiple sites. Some destruction layers show evidence of fire. Some sites were abandoned without obvious evidence of violent destruction, suggesting deliberate withdrawal rather than defeat. Linear B tablets from Pylos, found in the destruction layer, refer to emergency military preparations, ships being positioned, soldiers being called up, as if the palace administrators knew that something catastrophic was coming and were trying to prepare. But who or what the threat was, the tablets do not say. The Sea Peoples, a group or coalition of migrating peoples from uncertain origins who attacked Egypt and caused destruction throughout the eastern Mediterranean around this period, are one possible factor. Internal social collapse is another. Climate change causing drought and famine is increasingly supported by paleoclimatic data. The truth may be a combination of all of these, a system under multiple simultaneous stresses that finally exceeded the resilience of the civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, represents perhaps the most sophisticated urban culture of the ancient world that most people have never heard of. At its peak, between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization encompassed an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It included over 1,000 settlements spread across what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and parts of Afghanistan. Its two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each had populations estimated at 40,000 to 80,000 people at their height, making them among the largest cities in the ancient world. And these were not crude settlements. They were planned cities, laid out on grid systems with streets running at right angles, with centralized water supply systems, with standardized brick sizes across hundreds of kilometers of territory, with elaborate drainage and sewage systems that would not be matched in technological sophistication until Roman civilization, nearly 2,000 years later. They had public baths, granaries, and what appear to have been civic assembly halls. Their weights and measures were standardized across the entire civilization, implying a level of economic and administrative integration that is extraordinary for the 3rd millennium BCE. And then, around 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization began to collapse. Over the course of roughly 200 years, less than 10 generations, the great cities were abandoned. Mohenjo-Daro shows evidence of significant decline. The later occupation levels reveal poorer quality construction, smaller houses built on the ruins of the earlier, grander buildings, evidence of overcrowding and deteriorating sanitation. The elaborate drainage systems fell into disrepair. The standardized weights and measures ceased to be used. Trade with Mesopotamia, well documented in the period between 2350 and 1750 BCE, essentially stopped. And then the cities were abandoned altogether, their populations dispersing into smaller rural settlements in the foothills to the east. The Indus script, another writing system that has never been deciphered, disappeared with the civilization that created it, leaving us unable to read the administrative records, the religious texts, or whatever personal accounts may have been written as this world came apart. What destroyed the Indus Valley Civilization? Again, the honest answer is complex and contested. Aryan migration or invasion, once a popular theory, is now largely discredited, or at least heavily qualified, by archaeological and genetic evidence that does not support a dramatic population replacement in the collapse period. Climate change is a leading current hypothesis. Paleoclimatic data suggests that the monsoon patterns shifted significantly around 2000 BCE, reducing rainfall across the Indus Valley and making intensive agriculture increasingly difficult. River course changes, particularly changes to the course of the Gagar-Hakra river system, which may have been the legendary Saraswati River mentioned in the Vedas, likely disrupted water supplies to major agricultural areas. The combination of prolonged drought and hydrological disruption, sustained over decades and generations, may have made the maintenance of large urban centers simply unsustainable. But what strikes researchers who have spent careers studying the Indus Valley is not just that it collapsed. It is that it collapsed so completely and left so little legacy. The great cities were abandoned, but no historical text in any subsequent tradition, Sanskrit, Greek, Persian, records them or remembers them. The Indus script was never read again after the collapse. The hydraulic engineering knowledge, the sophisticated urban water management that was centuries ahead of its time, was lost. The civilization ended, and it ended so thoroughly that the physical ruins were not even recognized as ruins until the 1920s, when British archaeologists began to uncover what the landscape had buried. The Minoan civilization of ancient Crete is another member of this list whose disappearance has haunted archaeologists for generations. The Minoans, who dominated the Aegean world from approximately 2700 to 1450 BCE, were in many respects the first great maritime civilization of Europe. From their palace centers at Knossos, Phaistos, Mallia, and Zakros, the Minoans controlled trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean. Their art, the frescoes that covered the walls of their palaces, depicting dolphins, bull leapers, processions of beautiful figures, is among the most vibrant and joyful in the entire ancient world. Their palace at Knossos, the largest Bronze Age structure in the Aegean, had running water, flush toilets, and multi-story architecture that shows a level of architectural sophistication not matched in Europe for more than 1,000 years. The Minoans traded with Egypt, with the Near East, with mainland Greece. They were prosperous, creative, and, as far as we can tell from their art, which shows virtually no scenes of war, relatively peaceful. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoan palace centers outside of Knossos were destroyed, burned, and abandoned within what appears to be a relatively short period of time. What caused this destruction? The eruption of the Thera volcano on the island now called Santorini was once considered the primary cause, but current dating places the eruption at approximately 1628 BCE, nearly 2 centuries before the palace destruction, ruling it out as the direct cause, though its long-term effects on Minoan society, the destruction of the Thera settlement, the disruption of agricultural and trade patterns, the psychological and social impact of a catastrophic natural disaster, may have contributed to a prolonged weakening. Mycenaean Greek invasion and conquest is another hypothesis. There is evidence that Mycenaean culture replaced Minoan culture at Knossos after the destruction of the other palace centers, suggesting that the Mycenaeans may have taken advantage of a weakened or destabilized Minoan civilization to establish dominance. Whatever the cause, the Minoan civilization as a distinct cultural entity was over within the span of a generation or two, and with it went Linear A, the Minoan writing system that still defies all attempts at decipherment. The Akkadian Empire, which flourished in Mesopotamia from approximately 2334 to 2154 BCE, was the world's first true empire, the first political entity to unite multiple previously independent city-states under a single centralized authority, with a single administrative language, a single currency, and a single military command structure. Under Sargon of Akkad and his successors, particularly Naram Sin, the Akkadian Empire controlled territory stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf, incorporating diverse populations, resources, and cultural traditions within a single political framework. For nearly 2 centuries, The Akkadian Empire was the dominant political and military force in the ancient world. And then, around 2154 BCE, it collapsed with extraordinary speed. The evidence for the collapse comes from multiple sources. Administrative texts from the final period of the empire record increasing disruption, references to attacks by a people called the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains to the east, references to famine and food shortages, references to the abandonment of settlements in previously prosperous agricultural regions. The site of Tel Leilan, in what is now northeastern Syria, was excavated in the 1980s and 1990s, and what archaeologists found was remarkable. A 300-year gap in occupation, beginning around 2200 BCE, coinciding precisely with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. And within the geological record at Tel Leilan, in the sediment layers that accumulated during that 300-year gap, was evidence of a severe, prolonged drought that transformed a previously fertile agricultural region into a near-desert landscape. The Akkadian Empire, it appears, was at least partly destroyed by a volcanic eruption somewhere in the northern hemisphere around 2200 BCE, which disrupted global climate patterns and triggered a drought that lasted for centuries across the entire Fertile Crescent. This finding, that the first great empire in human history was destroyed, at least in part, by climate change triggered by a volcanic eruption, has profound implications that go beyond the study of the ancient world. It tells us something about the relationship between complex civilization and environmental stability. The Akkadian Empire, with all its administrative sophistication, all its military power, all its political integration, was ultimately fragile in the face of a sustained change in rainfall patterns. When the rain stopped coming, the food stopped growing. When the food stopped growing, the populations that depended on agricultural surplus to support an empire's urban centers, armies, and administrators could no longer sustain those structures. The empire didn't die in a battle, it died in a drought. And once the population had dispersed, once the farmers had fled and the cities had emptied, there was no bringing it back. The civilization of the ancient Anatolian city of Çatalhöyük, while technically a Neolithic settlement rather than an empire, deserves a place on this list because its disappearance raises some of the most profound questions about the nature of early human social organization. Çatalhöyük, located in south-central Turkey and occupied from approximately 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, was one of the largest and most densely populated settlements of its era anywhere in the world. At its peak, it may have housed up to 8,000 people, an extraordinary concentration of people for the Neolithic period, living in tightly packed mud brick houses with no streets between them, entered from holes in the rooftops, with the dead buried beneath the floors of the living spaces. The community's symbolic life was rich and complex. The walls of many houses were decorated with elaborate paintings of hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and figures that resist easy interpretation. Figurines, many of them representing large female forms that have been interpreted as mother goddess figures, were found throughout the site in large numbers. And then, around 5,700 BCE, Çatalhöyük was abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned, simply abandoned. The population dispersed and did not return. The site sat empty for millennia until the soil covered it and vegetation grew over it, and it became, to all external appearances, simply a slight mound in the Turkish landscape. A tell, in the archaeological terminology, covering the compressed remains of thousands of years of human occupation. What caused the people of Çatalhöyük to leave? Theories include climate change, soil exhaustion from intensive agriculture, social tensions within the densely packed community, and disease. But none of these theories is supported by conclusive evidence. The site simply ended. The people simply left. And wherever they went, they did not leave a record of why. The Olmec civilization of ancient Mesoamerica, the culture that built the massive stone heads, some weighing up to 40 tons, that stare with enigmatic expressions from sites along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, was the mother culture of all subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. The Olmec flourished from approximately 1500 to 400 BCE, creating the first large-scale monumental architecture in the Americas, developing early forms of writing and calendrical systems that would later be adopted and elaborated by the Maya, establishing long-distance trade networks that stretched from central Mexico to Guatemala and beyond, and creating artistic traditions, the colossal heads, the jade figurines, the ceramic vessels, that influenced Mesoamerican culture for 1,000 years after the Olmec themselves had disappeared. The major Olmec centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, were not destroyed simultaneously. San Lorenzo shows evidence of deliberate destruction and defacement of its monuments around 900 BCE, possibly representing either an internal social revolution or conquest by an outside group. La Venta continued into the 4th century BCE before it too was abandoned. But the end of the Olmec as a distinct and recognizable cultural and political entity came within a period of a few centuries, a few generations, and the mechanism of that end is disputed. Volcanic eruptions that disrupted agricultural systems in the Heartland region have been proposed. River course changes that altered the flood patterns that made the Gulf Coast lowlands so productive have been suggested. Internal social breakdown and elite overthrow have been theorized. What we know for certain is that the culture that produced those massive stone heads, a culture capable of moving 40-ton basalt boulders over 150 kilometers without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, simply ceased to function as a unified cultural entity, and the world that replaced it, while culturally indebted to the Olmec, was something different. The civilization of Great Zimbabwe, the medieval African state that built the massive stone enclosures that give both the ruins and the modern nation of Zimbabwe their names, represents another case of sudden civilizational collapse that Western historiography has been slow to fully engage with, partly because of the politics that surrounded the study of Great Zimbabwe for much of the colonial era. For decades, colonial-era scholars and administrators refused to accept that the sophisticated stone structures at Great Zimbabwe, the Great Enclosure, with its wall 11 meters high, 5 meters thick, and 250 meters in circumference, built without mortar from granite blocks fitted together with extraordinary precision, were built by the ancestors of the people who lived there when Europeans arrived. It was more comfortable, for certain ideological reasons, to invent mysterious ancient civilizations from elsewhere, Phoenicians, Arabs, Sabaeans, as the builders. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people of Zimbabwe, beginning around 1100 CE and reaching its peak between 1200 and 1450 CE. At its height, the Great Zimbabwe state controlled trade networks that moved gold from the interior of southern Africa to the Swahili coast cities of the Indian Ocean, connecting the African interior to trade routes that stretched to Arabia, India, and China. Chinese ceramics found at Great Zimbabwe, dating to the 14th and 15th centuries, demonstrate the extent of these connections. The city itself had a population of up to 18,000 people, and then, in the 15th century, it was abandoned. The capital moved. The political center shifted, and within a century, The great stone city was empty, its builders dispersed, its trade connections rerouted, its political structures dissolved. The Tiwanaku civilization of the Bolivian Altiplano, the high-altitude plateau surrounding Lake Titicaca at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, built one of the most remarkable religious and administrative centers of the ancient Americas. Tiwanaku, the city at the heart of this civilization, was occupied from approximately 1500 BCE and reached its peak influence between 500 and 1000 CE, when it functioned as the religious and political center of a state that may have had a population of over 1 million people spread across a vast territory encompassing much of modern Bolivia, southern Peru, and northern Chile. The architectural achievements of Tiwanaku are extraordinary. Massive stone gateways and platforms built from precisely cut andesite and sandstone blocks, including the famous Gate of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite with the image of a staff-bearing deity surrounded by 48 winged figures. The city's agricultural system, a network of raised fields separated by water channels covering hundreds of square kilometers of lakeshore, was a masterpiece of environmental engineering, using the thermal mass of the water in the channels to protect crops from the extreme nighttime frosts of the Altiplano. Around 1000 CE, Tiwanaku began to collapse.